This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. Hi guys, this is Common Sense Generation. I'm Kądzielska-Koper, and today we're talking about philosophy and especially body-mind problem, because with me in the studio is Ralph Weir, author, philosopher, associated to the University of Lincoln. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Ralph, I got you like between travels, let's say, because you're coming from many different places. Mm-hmm. But you are a professional philosopher, and your book, which you published about body-mind problem, I would say it's a problem which has been addressed by many philosophers in the history, but you're doing it again from, I would say, let's more a humanistic perspective. So tell me why it is still an important problem.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I have been traveling lots recently. I've just been living in Montenegro for the last month and flown in here to Warsaw from the UK yesterday and flying on to Croatia to run a summer school next week. So the life of an academic philosopher can be way more exciting than you might imagine. But during this intense travel, I also find as much time as I can to think about what I see as really fundamental philosophical problems that actually impinge on a lot of our deepest concerns as human beings, our kind of deep-rooted existential attitudes to life. And I came to the mind-body problem kind of indirectly. As you say, it's something loads of people have written about. It's arguably one of 2 or 3 central philosophical problems since the 17th century that people have focused on. I started out just gaining an interest in, I guess, like the life of the mind generally, literature, poetry, art, and so on. Kind of late, as maybe a 17-year-old, I started to see this as interesting. Before that, I paid no attention at all to kind of classes in school and things. And I decided I'll go to university, study philosophy, and I'll find out about these big questions about literature, culture, the nature of reality, and so on.
And then you discovered that philosophy is like no more interested in ontology.
Yeah.
For a lot of people. I'm sorry, I'm guessing it.
You guess exactly right. I once heard, I read a guy say, oh yeah, I went to philosophy university to learn about the nature of everything or whatever, but I felt like I'd walked into a convention of crossword enthusiasts, right? So the way...
Absolutely agree. Or enthusiasts of language, where, of course, this is important to learn a little bit about linguistic philosophy, but then you sitting half of the semester and just analyzing one sentence and asking yourself, where does it lead from? Where they don't totally want to touch any ontology except the history of philosophy, when, of course, they let you read Plato and St. Augustine, but that's basically this.
Yeah. We should probably say for your viewers, by ontology, we mean, the area of philosophy that studies being, the fundamental nature of reality, as it were. We tend to call it metaphysics in English-speaking departments, but we use the terms interchangeably. Some people use them slightly differently to one another. But yeah, I want to say, I actually think modern philosophy is in many ways thriving, and the kind of negative attitude I came away with as an undergraduate student wasn't wholly justified. But there is something weird about the way philosophy is done today. It tends to be highly technical, to focus in on what would strike any ordinary person as very small, arguably trivial issues. And this is kind of well known. Lots of people have said this about modern philosophy. It's partly to do with the way universities work and so on. But I wanted to get back to big questions. And I wondered, well, how am I going to do that? Actually, you mentioned studying Plato or St. Augustine. My first move was to go to Oxford and study ancient philosophy. I thought if I did that, then we'd be looking at really big ideas. But I found, for me at least, there was another problem, which is the focus was very much on interpreting one sentence of Aristotle, read it in the Greek and then write a book about what it might mean, rather than about whether Aristotle might be right, might have something to teach us. And, well, as a result of that, I went back to doing regular contemporary philosophy, but I had a couple of influences that set me on the path that led me to the mind-body problem and so on. One of those was a lecture by Roger Scruton, who I know you admire. He gave a talk called Neuroscience and the Soul in around 2011 at the University of Oxford. I'm told he wanted to call it Neuro-Nonsense and the Soul, but the university said that sounds too anti-scientific for us. But it was a brilliant lecture bringing out some of the kind of dehumanizing aspects of modern intellectual culture. And then another was a series of talks by Stephen Priest, who I think has been on this show, an utterly brilliant contemporary thinker who I went on to have the great fortune to study with, on philosophical questions, theological answers. In their different ways, both Scruton and Priest represented our understanding of ourselves as persons, where we fit as animated beings with a perspective onto the world that surrounds us, how that fits into our scientific, largely reductionist worldview as really the core question out of which many modern concerns of people interested in this stuff arise. So I decided then that's what I really want to study.
Well, I fully agree that this is exactly answers all of those. We have this philosophical intuitions. Let's say every one of us, even if we don't actually do philosophy in a more in a professional way, but we ask ourselves: are our body now only enough? But is there mind there? Is there soul there? Mm-hmm. And of course, and I would say there is no human being who can be fully satisfied only with the materialistic answer for it. I don't believe there is, even if we pretend that we just buddies. But we tend to see that there is something in us which is unchangeable, even though the body is changing or the mind is changing. And those of course are questions which already the Greek philosophers first asked themselves about and try to answer. And I love reading Plato, and I love reading him as a metaphysical author, as an author who actually talks about being and gives answers which are important until today, because this picture of soul having a black horse, white horse, is such an important notion about the human nature that we have this two elements, the urge for good and the urge for evil in our souls, which, for example, so lots of people who want to make revolutions only forget that, well, we are not angels here on earth, and we'll never be angels here on earth unless we, and this battle happens in our souls, not only outside. And Plato already has seen it, so everything is there. But when to realize it, you definitely need to have a step back and not believe in science as a new form of theology, even though, of course, science has a lot of answers. But I understand what you're doing right now as well. You take the body-mind problem, so how body and mind are connected, and where is this? I think one of the, what is the Pascal answer to it? That the connection is in one of the organs, I think.
People often mock Descartes for saying it was the pineal gland.
Yes.
Where the two link. Descartes has a million really exciting, interesting things to say on this topic, and one, slightly stupid sounding, patently false thing, and people really do him a disservice by quoting that all the time.
Sorry, but it's always funny, of course, for especially when you're studying philosophy. But those questions were there, and they are still important until today, all the time, because, well, human beings are still here. But so, what is your answer in your book?
Yeah. So, first of all, I totally agree with you about how brilliant Plato is. Reading Plato I guess was another huge influence on me while I was studying ancient philosophy. The Phaedrus, which you refer to, is, I don't know, when I'm asked what's my favorite philosophical work, I sometimes say that it's a beautiful work of literature full of interesting insights and ideas, not rigorously argued in the way that we have to try to do in modern universities, but utterly brilliant. And it is central to that, this idea that the notion of the soul is linked to our nature as moral beings with responsibilities to one another. If you really think, ultimately, you and I are just the toing and throwing of unconscious physical particles, then it's very natural to suppose, well, moral responsibility, all of that is some kind of illusion or some kind of maybe a useful fiction. And of course, a lot of people do think that. I guess, my big picture outlook is that's part of the problem. If you take too seriously a scientifically reductionist view of the world, you end up failing to take seriously all of the most important things in life, moral responsibility, aesthetic appreciation, all of the stuff that at least I feel we should be thinking about. But what was the follow-up question?
One notion about rigorous, as you mentioned, that rigoristic way of explaining certain things in philosophy.
Yeah.
I think this is, for example, the brilliance of the Roger Scruton, which you mentioned, and who was also my escape at certain point when I was, fed up with time worms in ontology, which we were of course doing, or
four-dimensional space-time worms,
exactly, which were bringing me exactly to, or just semiotic, which of course is important, and there is a beautiful Warsaw Lviv logic school, which of course we have to learn about, but you want to have those tools to eventually get to the meat, so to the ontology.
Yeah.
And then I was able to came across political philosophy with answers of Roger Scruton, who does a little bit the same thing as Plato did. He uses like artistic language, even more literature one, to put very important, sophisticated philosophical ideas into it. So such books as Why Art is Important, Where Culture is Important, or even How to Be Conservative can be read by anyone, but can be read also by philosophers, and they are important. So this was for me discovery that, okay, there is a way of doing philosophy even today who is not completely dull.
Yeah. I something I sometimes say about Roger, who he of course he wrote a couple of books on essentially the mind-body problem and related issues. He didn't call them that exactly, but I think The Soul of the World, his book on human nature, to a degree, The Face of God, all deal with these issues. And one thing that's great about these books is, as you say, you can read it and just enjoy reading because he's got brilliant prose. Another thing is, although Roger thinks very rigorously about the view he's going to take, he doesn't, just say, oh, well, I like the former view before all this scientific reductionism, so I'm going to try and defend Plato or Aquinas or Descartes. He has his own quite novel stance. But what he doesn't do, and what I think quite a lot of us philosophers end up doing for the worst of our output, is getting stuck on the first question. So you'll often find people who sort of say, well, human nature, that's really important, isn't it? I want to know about that. And so then they'll say, well, what about the relationship between mind and body? That's really central to this area. Let's focus on that. And then they say, well, one aspect of the mind is representation. We can represent objects and ideas about the world, so let's focus on that. And then someone will lead a decades-long career just hammering away at that first issue without ever getting back to the big issues that made it seem worthwhile to investigate this subject in the first place. Loads of cool, interesting stuff comes out of this, But it's inevitable that for most people, it will feel a little disappointing. So Roger's books are excellent for that. He's not alone. I think Thomas Nagel is brilliant. Mary Midgley is brilliant for keeping the big issues in view. I could name a whole bunch of others, but one thing I and some of my colleagues who you've met in philosophy have been trying to do is create a space for that kind of humanistic, big picture philosophy to take place, given that it doesn't tend to be what people are encouraged to focus on in their academic careers.
Fully agree. And also it is important that people have enough courage to go this path, and use also, for example, artistic language to show certain intuitions which are in philosophy. But this is also the beauty of poetry, that you can very often, or literature, in a different way express what is very hard to express only with scientific language. Mm-hmm. But coming back to the body-mind problem, and so could you give us examples of answers that were given so far? And I also would like to touch, for example, like emergentism, which in this way showing that I think it's an important notion just to show that. But we'll get there. We'll get there. First, where's the answers? What are the answers we can get? Body-mind problem.
So the mind-body problem, actually, like there's a family of problems in this area. Some to do with personal identity, some to do with free will, to do with thought. The problem most people have been talking about for the last couple of decades is the problem of conscious experience. So the way I like to introduce this is to say, in some respects, we're a lot like ordinary physical objects, right? I have a body, it's got a shape, a size, a weight, it has moving parts. So it's a bit like a complicated physical object, a clock or something. But unlike a clock or a computer, I also have this first-person perspective onto the world filled with colors, shapes, sounds, sensations, emotions, that at least seems to many people to be, in some sense, private to me. I can tell you how I'm feeling, but you can't feel my sensations for me in the way that we can both look at the table in front of us. And so the question is just, how come? How come there's this radical difference such that sometimes you have a load of particles moving around and there is no inner conscious world, and in other cases, in the case of a human being or nervous system or brain, there is. Now, one thing I've discovered studying this issue over many years is almost every society globally and historically has tended towards the same rough answer to this question, which is that unlike a clock or a computer or whatever, in addition to our physical bodies, we also have immaterial souls. There's a second thing present which is radically different in kind. It is intimately related to the body. Some versions of this view, more Aristotelian versions, have a lot to say about how, in fact, it is the soul that in some sense gives form to the body, that is responsible for its functioning as a living organism. But you get again and again that same idea. You'll find it in the Chinese classics. You'll find it in certainly the early Indian philosophical tradition as represented by the Upanishads, the Orthodox Hindu schools, in the Jain school, and you definitely find it in, I'd say, a majority of the classic Western thinkers. Throughout history, there's also been an alternative view represented most prominently by Epicurus in the Western tradition and by the Charvaka school in the Indian tradition, that says, no, in fact, we're just bodies, we're just congeries of physical particles moving about. And all of this other stuff, my conscious experience now, my awareness of the room, my perspective onto you, that somehow emerges out of what is ultimately just unconscious matter moving around. So these views, they don't deny we have conscious experience and all the rest, but they say somehow it comes out of the movement of unconscious matter. And explaining how that works has proven super difficult. Actually, nowadays, there's a lot of interest in a third view that says, in some sense, the conscious experience, at least as characterized by people like me who think there really are these qualitative internal states I'm aware of, it's an illusion. In fact, this is some kind of either natural illusion we enter into, or maybe some kind of persistent theoretical error we've made from engaging in philosophy in the wrong way. So those are two versions of materialism, one that tries to rescue the mind and one that is more comfortable with dismissing it. Another popular view historically that nowadays doesn't tend to get much attention is idealism, which says actually it's not the mind, the internal conscious states that are an illusion, it's the physical world. In fact, the physical world exists only insofar as we experience it. That's George Berkeley's version of this view. Or underlying what we take to be unconscious matter is always actually some kind of mind or spirit. That's the kind of view Leibniz adopted, and the contemporary philosopher Philip Goff has done a lot of work to bring back something along the lines of that view. I guess people tend to resist that on a show about common sense. It hardly needs to be said why. I actually think all these are very interesting, but I'm much more drawn to those that take seriously the reality of the mind, the reality that we're not mere moist robots, to use a term that sometimes gets thrown around in these discussions.
Funny thing, but for a really long time, I thought Leibniz is actually nuts with his, atoms. With his ideas that we are like those bubbles who have the whole universe, monads, have inside everything, and they cannot communicate. But the older I get, and the more I need to communicate with other people, especially in the family, I tend to realize maybe we are monads who just have the whole world inside, and there's like almost no communication between each other, but everyone has their own perspective about everything. And as you mentioned, we cannot step into other people's feet, but we try to imagine how that would be. Mm-hmm. And already for many, it is very hard to imagine. But what I want to more dig into is this emergentism, as I said. So let's just give it on an example of a cake, and you will elaborate it more. But well, when we have a cake, it is all of those ingredients. So we can there is flour, eggs, sugar, butter in it, and though we can take it down to all of those things, when we mix it together, it is something new and something with completely new qualities. And with new perspective, new reality, which was not before there. And this is a little bit the same answer with body-mind, that we can take our body and human being to all of those particles first, and even down to atoms, but it doesn't explain who human being is. So when we put all of those atoms in, and we have the human being, it is not only the atoms, it is something new.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people are comfortable as a kind of what sounds like a fairly cozy compromised position to suppose, it's not the case that we're merely moist robots. There really is a mind, an inner life, maybe something that deserves to be called a soul. Some materialists like Douglas Hofstadter are happy to use that term. However, it's something that emerges in the way that the macroscopic properties of a cake emerge from the ingredients. There's no extra ingredient there. My own opinion is that under scrutiny, this turns out to be a really difficult position to maintain. And the reason for that is, well, there are two things we might mean by emergence. We might mean something literally radically new emerges, is caused to come into existence, arrange matter into the shape of a nervous system, and a soul pops into being. Well, I mean, that sounds like a crazy idea, but I don't have anything to say that would disprove it. And I think that would accommodate the intuitive everyday view that we have this outer physical characteristics to us associated with our bodies, but also this inner mental or spiritual world associated with our minds. But usually when people talk about emergence, they don't want to say some new thing pops into being like that in a kind of magical way. They want to say, in some sense, something new comes into being whose existence involves nothing more than the relationships between the parts. There's sort of a complex relationship that results in new characteristics. The cake example is kind of chemically complex, but a more simple example would be, how come water has the macroscopic properties of liquidity, right? Why is it that water takes the shape of the vessel that it's in, whereas other substances, a piece of wood or whatever, will not do that? And one can give a really good explanation for this. The explanation is roughly that the bonds between the individual water particles, the hydrogen bonds, are strong enough to stop the particles from dispersing as they would in a gas, but they're too weak to prevent they're not strong enough to hold all the particles in a rigid position with respect to one another. And so you pour water into a mug and it fills it up, taking the shape of its container. Now, there you have an emergent property that clearly does not require anything extra over and above the H2O particles and the kind of bonds that exist between them. We can see why the stuff we have at the microscopic level would result in the macroscopic emergent property of liquidity that no H2O molecule has on its own.
But on the other hand,
but
water.
in the case of the mind, we don't have anything like that explanation.
Exactly, because water doesn't have, it doesn't come out of the cup by himself. It doesn't show any
So far as we know, it doesn't have an inner life or experience of its own, although Philip Goff might argue that, or Leibniz might say we might be mistaken about that. But they'd say if it does, that's got to be something fundamental. It's not something such that we could see how it emerges from the chemical or more fundamental physical relationships between elementary particles. If we could give such an explanation, then emergentism would seem like a really excellent position to take. But while we can't, I want to say it's kind of a cop-out, or it's brushing the problem under the carpet. Yeah. Use the word emergence like a magic wand, and ta-da, you get a mind. I don't think it's really satisfactory.
This is Common Sense Generation. If you like this channel, please subscribe, share, and comment. Your voice really matters.
It definitely is not satisfactory in this case that we still see that body is something more than a machine. And one thing, even if we cannot take body down and sew it again and still have life in it, even if theoretically all the particles should work, they don't work. There's this sparkle, of course, which at last more people who with more religious position would say that this is a soul. But
a nice example that some people give when defending an Aristotelian take on this issue is, if you take a living human person and put them in a sack and squeeze it, crush it until it's sort of completely crushed, you'll have all the same matter there, but you'll no longer have a human person. And the question is, so what's going on here?
Very brutal, but also very true.
Kind of horrifying example, maybe.
Absolutely, but we put a point here. Ralph Weir was the guest of Common Sense Generation, and his book, Body and Mind, is...
The Mind-Body Problem and Metapysics.
The Mind-Body Problem and Metapysics is available on Amazon, if I'm correct. So you can dig in more into this problem, which is absolutely fascinating and which, touches all of us, because we all have mind and body. And we can ask, what's the relation of them. Thank you for watching Common Sense Generation. And I also thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation.